But in this closing ideas of the talk at Varaman, we're beginning to speak of a kind of a completion of this speech. It's, we've called it, referred to it in a couple of ways. The pratyahara, which is the dynamic of the stopping of the mind. And that stopping of the mind is the fruit of a slow, steady exhaustion of the process of the senses feeding the brain and constantly hard lining into the six sensory fields. And a kind of diversion of attention is beginning to occur where one begins to experience the subtle physical body as much or more than they do the sensory body. One begins to experience the causal body as much or more as they do the subtle physical and physical body, etc. And so you slowly but surely build up. It's a kind of antitoxin for the ego, and all of the basis of the ego is slowly subverted by the onslaught of the effect of the direct feed of the fourth state, which is happening when we go into the samadhi states together. The samadhi represents the completion of the first cycle. And as the samadhi comes in, we get the very first taste of the mind slowing and stopping. Even before you have your absolutely first full score samadhi, you'll have episodes where you'll have very high meditations. You'll have a glimpse of the high ground. You'll be just walking along, alone in the night, and suddenly you'll switch out of this world and you'll feel yourself connected to all things, all times, and everything. You'll be there for a second, and then you'll switch back and you'll go, wow. This will happen continuously. But this idea of when you first steam into samadhi as the fruit of a concerted effort of spiritual endeavor, by which time you've rounded yourself up, your will. You've enhanced the capacity of your action, suppressing and systematically eliminating involvement in the poisonous activities of ignorance, delusion, desire, in all their forms. And you've begun to and you've swapped them out for the higher angels. You've gained Shaktipat. You've been practicing and pushing that envelope. And then one day, for seemingly no reason, you'll just glide straight through into samadhi. Everything falls away, the 10 billion suns arise. It's both incredibly exciting and incredibly terrifying at the same time. Everybody feels that way, and it's always a surprise. Because what has taken place in the samadhi event is a definite expiration of the ego. There's a period where you'll be in samadhi, but then it'll be just temporary enough, there'll be still shards of the ego left, and you'll gather them up and move them forward. But by that time, the force of the fourth plane, the fourth state, has got a hold of you and will continue to draw you. The Guru will see to that. Even if you try to stop it, it's too late. It's one of the points of the value of the Guru. Because there are subtle instincts of survival. The ego will assert its own survival up to the very last. But what begins to take place at this point in samadhi is that we begin to experience genuinely the stopping of the mind. The mind stops. When the mind stops, the egocentric I stops. At this point, this is the point where the tea leaves have sunk to the bottom of the cup. The water is crystal clear. And you can see the panorama. You can see the aurora of infinite mind, the unbelievable glory of the subtle physical body, and the countless forms of life that arise in all of these world systems. It's indescribable. At the same time, you'll begin to be touching the basis of pure consciousness. Formless consciousness, or formlessness, or what we call emptiness. There's no quality. Once you start to get drawn deep into the samadhi nature, there's no experience that the mind can generate as a capacity. Any phenomenal experience is, however exalted, a form of imputed terms. Consciousness has no quality whatsoever. And that the assembly of any phenomenal experience is a cross-section, a matrix between the subtle architecture of being and consciousness itself. And then when we look at any given thing, we begin to see that it has no intrinsic existence. It is the effect of a compound action of imputed terms and what Baba always called the play of consciousness. And this is when the idea of existence and non-existence, the existence of the self as a separate I, comes under true threat. And that threat is borne out in the terms of this state, the pratyahara, which it describes the event of the stopping of the mind, but as you translate the word pratyahara, it translates as the exhaustion and starvation of the mind. In other words, the mind ceases to be fed any phenomenal data, and it's simply starved and exhausted into a collapse. The event of the stopping of the mind is oftentimes described as the collapse of the mind. It's like a house of cards that's holding itself together by the movement of phenomenal action. When that stops, it collapses under its own weight. The Sufis use a term that's even more violent called manonaj, which means the annihilation of the mind. But this is the effect, the growing effect of the samadhi. And this is also the onset of true enlightenment, when enlightenment starts to become very serious. Now it's interesting to note that the first samadhi is thought to be, it's a way station, and a very important way station. You have achieved personal liberation. You have cleared yourself from the wheel. But there's still detritus, leftover phenomenal energy flowing in the stream. This is where emptiness begins to come in, where we begin to systematically take apart the actual wheel. Where the entire chain of the events of production goes into full cessation. And the turning of the wheel of cessation gains more and more speed. It is the dynamic of the appearance and realization of emptiness that begins to signify an enlightenment that is beginning to gain depth. At first it starts and it's held to be shallow. But as emptiness begins to gather force inside the experiential stream, that enlightenment becomes deeper and deeper. There's a point where it becomes immovable, irresistible, and sustained. This is also characterized by the movement from Savikalpa, which is the original samadhi. And the Savikalpa means, it's another, you could use the same thing, Savikalpa means samadhi with signs. In other words, there are still elements of identity side by side with the event of samadhi. And it's important to understand that the Savikalpa samadhi is extremely profound. You have the experience, I am God. Not only do you experience God, but you experience yourself as God. But the idea of I am God is the giveaway. The I has somehow survived. And there is a subtle shadow there. And that is the classification of the Savikalpa. As it progresses, it moves into the immediate station, and this is where the Guru again comes in, seeing the approach of the samadhi. Emptiness must appear immediately so that the person knows that they are still progressing and don't delude themselves into thinking they've come to the final goal. And it's the progression of the value or the phenomenon of emptiness that begins to permeate the samadhi ever deeper and ever deeper and ever deeper until the mind becomes thoroughly stopped. And this is where we come into the idea of the nirvikalpa, the root word of which is nirvana. Nirvana means to extinguish. The nirvi means without sign, without thought. In other words, all thought waves, all vrittis in the mind have ceased. In other words, there's not the slightest basis for the existence of the ego. It's been thoroughly exhausted.